There is a street in New Orleans that has been many things: a colonial thoroughfare, a jazz corridor, a cultural landmark, and eventually a monument to its own excess. It has survived hurricanes, epidemics, economic collapse, and decades of slow erosion. This is the rise and fall of Bourbon Street, party capital on the edge. The street before the party. Bourbon Street is 13 blocks long, running through the heart of the French Quarter from Canal Street to Esplanade Avenue. It was laid out in 1721 as part of the original grid plan for New Orleans, drawn by French engineer Adrien de Pouget under the direction of Jean-Baptiste Lemoine de Bienville, the city's founder. The name has nothing to do with whiskey. It comes from the House of Bourbon, the French royal dynasty that controlled Louisiana at the time of the city's founding. The French Quarter, the Vieux Carré, or Old Square, was the original footprint of New Orleans, and Bourbon Street ran through its center. The architecture that lines the street today is largely not French at all, despite the name of the neighborhood. After a series of fires in 1788 and 1794 destroyed much of the original French colonial construction, the quarter was rebuilt primarily under Spanish rule, giving it the wrought iron balconies, interior courtyards, and stucco facades that define its character today. For most of the 18th and early 19th centuries, Bourbon Street was a residential and commercial thoroughfare. The families who built the French Quarter, Creole families of French and Spanish descent, free people of color who formed a substantial and prosperous middle class, and eventually American arrivals after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, lived on or near Bourbon Street in the townhouses and cottages that still stand. It was not a party destination, it was a neighborhood. Opera was a significant part of early New Orleans cultural life, and the French Opera House, which stood on the corner of Bourbon and Toulouse Streets, was one of the most important opera venues in North America from its opening in 1859 until it burned down in 1919. The New Orleans opera tradition predated the French Opera House by decades. The city had been hosting opera since at least the 1790s, making it one of the earliest and most active opera cities on the continent. For much of the 19th century, Bourbon Street was associated with high culture as much as anything else. That identity began to shift gradually, and then more rapidly, through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the French Quarter itself changed. Wealthier Creole families moved to newer, more fashionable neighborhoods upriver, replaced by working-class immigrants, Sicilians, Irish, Germans, and by the bohemian artists and writers who were drawn to the quarter's cheap rents and atmospheric decay. By the early 20th century, the French Quarter had become one of the more racially and economically mixed urban neighborhoods in the South, and Bourbon Street had begun its slow transformation into an entertainment corridor. Jazz, Storyville, and the sound that built the street. To understand what Bourbon Street became, you have to understand what was happening a few blocks away. Storyville, the legally sanctioned red light district that operated from 1897 to 1917, sat just outside the French Quarter's boundaries on the downtown side. It was established by a city ordinance sponsored by Alderman Sidney Story, who was reportedly mortified to have it named after him, as an attempt to contain prostitution within a defined geographic area. Storyville became one of the birthplaces of jazz, the music that developed in New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries drew from an extraordinary confluence of influences: West African rhythmic traditions brought by enslaved people, European harmonic structures, Caribbean musical forms carried in through constant trade with Cuba and Haiti, and the blues tradition developing simultaneously in the Mississippi Delta. The musicians who worked in Storyville's clubs and houses, Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver, Louis Armstrong in his earliest years, were developing something genuinely new. when the U.S. Navy Department forced the closure of Storyville in 1917, arguing that it posed a moral hazard to sailors at the nearby naval base. The musicians who had worked there dispersed. Many went north in the Great Migration, carrying jazz to Chicago, New York, and beyond. But the musical culture they left behind in New Orleans didn't disappear. It settled into the French Quarter, and Bourbon Street began to absorb it. Through the 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s, Bourbon Street developed a genuine entertainment district. Jazz clubs, supper clubs, and dance halls opened along the Strip. The music was real, not a simulation of something, but an active, living tradition performed by musicians who were part of the culture that had created it. New Orleans had a unique legal relationship with alcohol as well. The city had a long tradition of permissive drinking laws rooted in its French and Spanish Catholic heritage, and prohibition, while nominally enforced, never really took hold in the way it did in other American cities. The federal agents who came to enforce the Volstead Act in New Orleans faced a city that had been drinking openly since the 1700s and didn't particularly regard the arrangement as negotiable. Bourbon Street in the 1930s and 40s was genuinely vibrant, genuinely musical, and genuinely itself. There was a time when every club on that street had real music, not a jukebox, not a cover band, but somebody who grew up in this city playing something that came from this city. A longtime New Orleans musician quoted in a 1990s oral history of the French Quarter. The post-war period brought tourists in greater numbers, drawn by the street's growing national reputation. The infrastructure to serve them, bars, restaurants, clubs, expanded accordingly. For a while, the growth didn't fundamentally change what Bourbon Street was. It just meant more people were experiencing it. The Golden Era and what it actually looked like. The period from roughly the late 1940s through the 1960s is the one most often invoked when people talk about Bourbon Street's Golden Era, and the nostalgia is not entirely manufactured. The Strip had developed a genuine ecosystem of entertainment that, while commercially oriented, still drew on the deep musical and culinary traditions of the city. The famous Door, which opened on Bourbon Street in 1934, became one of the most well-known jazz clubs on the Strip, featuring continuous live music in a format that anticipated the modern jazz club model. Al Hirt, the trumpet player who became one of New Orleans' most famous musical exports, played Bourbon Street clubs regularly in the 1950s and 60s. Pete Fountain, the clarinetist, was a Bourbon Street institution for decades. These were not obscure figures playing for tourists who didn't know better. They were nationally recognized musicians who happened to be deeply rooted in the New Orleans tradition and chose to stay. Arnaud's Restaurant, which opened on Bienville Street just off Bourbon in 1918, and Galatoire's, which has been operating on Bourbon Street itself since 1905, represented the culinary dimension of what the Strip offered at its best. These were serious restaurants with serious food. Creole cooking at a level of refinement that reflected the city's French and Spanish heritage and its unique agricultural and seafood resources. Going to Bourbon Street in this era could mean something more than drinking. It could mean a meal at Galatoire's, a jazz set at the famous Door, and a walk back through a neighborhood that felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it as much as to the visitors who came to see it. The strip clubs that became Bourbon Street's most visible feature in later decades were present by the 1950s and 60s as well, but they operated alongside rather than instead of the musical and culinary culture. The burlesque tradition had deep roots in New Orleans entertainment history, and venues like the Show Bar and the 500 Club operated as legitimate entertainment destinations rather than the lowest common denominator establishments that would eventually dominate the street. Chris Owens, the entertainer and club owner who opened her own venue on Bourbon Street in 1967 and continued performing there well into her 80s, represented something of the professional entertainment tradition that Bourbon Street once supported. A performer with a genuine act, a permanent venue, and a relationship to the city that extended far beyond a single transaction with a passing tourist. Her longevity on the Strip, in a landscape defined by turnover and disposability, said something about what the street once rewarded and what it eventually stopped being able to sustain. The French Quarter as a whole was in a complicated period during these decades. It had been designated a historic district in 1936, one of the first such designations in the United States, which protected its architectural fabric from demolition. But protection from demolition didn't prevent the gradual demographic shift as middle-class residents continued to leave and the neighborhood's resident population shrank. The people who called the quarter home were increasingly either very poor or very invested in the bohemian character of the place. Artists, writers, musicians. The tourists who came for Bourbon Street were passing through a neighborhood with a living population, not a theme park with a residential veneer. The long slide. The decline of Bourbon Street is not a story with a single cause or a clear beginning. It's a gradual accumulation of pressures and decisions that, over the course of several decades, transformed a street with genuine character into a commercial corridor optimized for maximum short-term extraction from visitors who would never return. Several forces drove this. The first was the economics of the entertainment business itself. Live jazz, played by skilled musicians who had spent years developing their craft, is expensive to produce and requires an audience willing to pay for it. As Bourbon Street became more tourist-dependent through the 1960s and 70s, the economic pressure to replace live music with recorded music or to replace jazz with louder, simpler entertainment that didn't require the same caliber of performer became significant. Strip clubs and bar-oriented businesses had lower overhead and higher margins than jazz clubs with full bands. The second force was the physical degradation of the French Quarter itself. Decades of deferred maintenance, absentee ownership, and the economic pressures of a city that was never particularly wealthy meant that the building stock of the quarter deteriorated even as it was theoretically protected. The residents who remained were often living in substandard conditions. The bohemian character of the neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s shaded into genuine poverty for many of its inhabitants. The third force was the concentrated impact of Mardi Gras tourism, which expanded dramatically through the 1970s and 80s and began to define how the rest of the country understood Bourbon Street. Mardi Gras in New Orleans has a history going back to the city's earliest years. French settlers were celebrating it by the early 18th century. And the carnival tradition that developed over the following centuries was a genuinely complex cultural institution involving elaborate crew organizations, parade routes, ball traditions, and neighborhood celebrations that had little to do with the Bourbon Street bead throwing and public drinking that became the national image of the holiday. The national image won. As Mardi Gras tourism grew, Bourbon Street's businesses optimized for the Mardi Gras visitor, someone who wanted cheap, strong alcohol in large quantities, tolerated or encouraged public nudity, and was not particularly concerned with the authenticity or quality of what they were consuming. The street adapted to serve that market, and in adapting, it began to lose the market it had previously served. By the time I got here in the early 1980s, you could already tell which direction it was going. The music was getting louder and simpler. The places that had been there for decades were getting bought out. The people who had built that street were leaving. A French Quarter resident quoted in a 2006 documentary on New Orleans history, "Hurricane Katrina and the reset that wasn't On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near Burris, Louisiana, as a Category 3 storm. The storm surge that followed overwhelmed the levee system protecting New Orleans, flooding approximately 80% of the city to depths ranging from a few inches to more than 20 feet. Nearly 1,800 people died. More than 1 million people were displaced across the Gulf Coast region. The damage to New Orleans alone was estimated at $125 billion. The French Quarter and Bourbon Street were among the few areas of the city that did not flood significantly. The original footprint of New Orleans, the high ground along the crescent of the Mississippi River where the city was first established, sat above the flood levels that destroyed newer neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward, Lakeview, and Gentilly. The irony was not lost on longtime residents. The oldest part of the city, built on the highest ground, survived while the 20th century additions built on drained swampland were destroyed. In the immediate aftermath, the French Quarter was evacuated along with the rest of the city. When residents and business owners began returning in the fall of 2005, Bourbon Street was among the first areas to reopen. The city's leadership, including Mayor Ray Nagin, actively promoted the reopening of the tourist corridor as evidence of New Orleans' resilience and as a signal to the rest of the country that the city was coming back. That decision had consequences. Focusing recovery resources and attention on Bourbon Street, the most visible and economically productive tourist corridor, meant less attention on the neighborhoods where the people who actually made the city's culture were trying to return. Musicians, chefs, service workers, the entire workforce that made the French Quarter function. Many of them had lived in the flooded neighborhoods. Their return was dependent on those neighborhoods being rebuilt, and the rebuilding was slow, inadequate, and in many cases never completed. New Orleans lost roughly 100,000 residents permanently after Katrina. The people who didn't come back were disproportionately African American, disproportionately working class, and disproportionately the bearers of the musical, culinary, and cultural traditions that had given Bourbon Street whatever authenticity it retained. The street reopened. The culture that had once animated it was harder to replace than the bars. The Road Home program, the federal grant program administered through the state of Louisiana to help homeowners rebuild or relocate, was plagued by delays, bureaucratic failures, and a formula that calculated grants based on pre-storm property values rather than rebuilding costs, which meant homeowners in lower-income neighborhoods received significantly less money than those in wealthier areas, even if their rebuilding costs were similar. The program eventually dispersed billions of dollars, but the process was slow enough and inequitable enough that many residents simply gave up and built lives elsewhere. The jazz musicians, the Mardi Gras Indians, the social aid and pleasure club members, the second-line brass band players. They were residents of flooded neighborhoods, not of the French Quarter, and their return depended on a rebuilding process that was neither fast enough nor fair enough to bring everyone back. What Bourbon Street became. In the years after Katrina, Bourbon Street completed a transformation that had been underway for decades. The street that emerged was optimized for a specific kind of visitor and a specific kind of experience. Large volumes of alcohol, a carnival atmosphere available every night of the year rather than just during Mardi Gras, and an environment designed for people who wanted to be somewhere they'd heard about rather than somewhere that meant anything. The hand grenade, a signature frozen cocktail served in a souvenir cup shaped like a hand grenade from a small chain of outlets called Tropical Isle, became one of the most recognized symbols of contemporary Bourbon Street. The drink was invented in the 1980s, and its recipe is proprietary. The cup is meant to be carried down the street. It is, in the most literal sense, a product designed for ambulatory public consumption, by someone who wants a souvenir of the experience. It has nothing to do with New Orleans culture, jazz, Creole food, or any of the things that made the city worth visiting. The live music that remains on Bourbon Street today is largely confined to a few blocks near Canal Street and consists primarily of cover bands playing rock and pop for bar crowds. The jazz tradition that the street once embodied, imperfectly, commercially, but genuinely, is more authentically present on Frenchman Street in the Marigny neighborhood, a 10-minute walk from Bourbon Street, where a cluster of music clubs features New Orleans musicians playing original material for audiences that include locals. Frenchman Street is what Bourbon Street used to be, or at least a closer approximation of it. The noise on Bourbon Street has become a physical fact of life for the remaining residential population of the French Quarter. Residents of buildings immediately adjacent to the Strip live with nightclub levels of sound until the early hours of the morning on most nights of the week. The conflict between the commercial interests of bar operators and the quality of life of French Quarter residents has been a persistent political and legal issue for years, with neighborhood associations, city council members, and the state legislature involved in ongoing disputes about noise ordinances, operating hours, and the future of the street. You can love New Orleans and avoid Bourbon Street. In fact, most people who really love New Orleans do exactly that. A sentiment repeated so often by locals, it has become something close to consensus: the safety question. Bourbon Street has become increasingly associated with violent crime, and the numbers are not reassuring. New Orleans consistently ranks among the cities with the highest per capita murder rates in the United States. The French Quarter, and Bourbon Street specifically, generates a disproportionate share of the city's high-profile violent incidents. Not because the neighborhood has the city's highest crime rate overall, but because the concentration of intoxicated tourists in a small geographic area, combined with the street's open container culture and its attraction of both predatory criminals and security gaps, creates conditions for violence. The most significant recent incident occurred on New Year's Day 2025, when a man drove a pickup truck into a crowd celebrating on Bourbon Street, killing 14 people and injuring dozens more. The attacker, Shamsuddin Jabbar, a U.S. Army veteran from Texas, was killed in a subsequent confrontation with police. It was the deadliest attack in New Orleans history and drew immediate national attention to the question of how a street permanently configured for massive pedestrian crowds had remained so vulnerable to vehicle access. The bollards that should have blocked vehicle access at key intersections had been removed for maintenance and not replaced at the time of the attack. The city had known about the security gap. The failure was administrative and logistical, not unforeseen. The possibility of a vehicle attack on a crowded pedestrian street had been a recognized security concern for years following similar attacks in other cities. The attack forced a reckoning with questions that New Orleans had been deferring. How much of the city's economy can be built on a single street configured for maximum revelry, with minimum safety infrastructure? And what are the obligations of a city government to the tourists it actively courts and the residents who live alongside them? The bollard failure was not unique in the landscape of American public space security lapses, but its consequences in this case were catastrophic enough to force the kind of conversation the city had avoided. In the weeks following the attack, the city installed reinforced security infrastructure at key entry points on Bourbon Street. The question of whether a street configured the way Bourbon Street is, permanently open, permanently crowded, permanently oriented around the loosening of inhibitions, can ever be made truly secure, remains genuinely unresolved, and not just in New Orleans. The economic dependency and the city behind it. Tourism is the engine of New Orleans' economy in a way that is difficult to overstate. The city attracts roughly 18 to 19 million visitors a year in normal years, generating billions of dollars in economic activity. The French Quarter and Bourbon Street sit at the center of that tourism infrastructure, capturing a significant share of the visitor spending that flows through the city. The dependency cuts both ways. The city needs the revenue that tourism generates for services, for infrastructure, for the functions of government in a place with chronic fiscal challenges. But the dominance of tourism also shapes what New Orleans invests in and what it neglects. Neighborhoods that don't contribute to the tourist economy compete for resources against a corridor that generates direct, measurable revenue. The contest is not equal. New Orleans also faces the compounding challenge of climate change and sea level rise in ways more acute than almost any other American city. Much of the metropolitan area sits below sea level, protected by a levee and pump system that the Army Corps of Engineers has been upgrading since Katrina at enormous cost. The city loses land to coastal erosion at a rate that makes its long-term geographic viability a genuine question. The communities that have historically served as the buffer between the city and the Gulf, the Houma, the Ile de Jean, Charles Band of Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, and other indigenous communities, have been watching their land disappear for decades. The Ile de Jean? Charles community is widely cited as the first climate refugee community in the United States, with tribal land shrinking from approximately 22,000 acres in 1955 to fewer than 320 acres by the mid-2010s. Bourbon Street operates in the middle of all of this, as though the party is permanent and the geography is stable. The gap between the street's relentless commercial optimism and the fragility of everything surrounding it is one of the more striking things about spending time in New Orleans if you pay any attention to the city beyond the Strip. What's left worth saving? The French Quarter is not Bourbon Street, and that distinction matters. The neighborhood that surrounds the Strip still contains some of the most significant surviving examples of colonial-era urban architecture in North America. The Cabildo, the building on Jackson Square where the Louisiana Purchase was signed in 1803, is a museum now. The St. Louis Cathedral, which has stood in various forms on the same site since 1718 and in its current form since 1850, is still an active parish church. The streets of the quarter away from Bourbon, Royal Street with its antique dealers and galleries, Chartres Street, the residential blocks of the upper quarter, still function as a place people live and work, not just a place tourists pass through. The culinary tradition that New Orleans developed over 3 centuries, the synthesis of French technique, African ingredients and cooking methods, Spanish influence, Native American plant knowledge, and Caribbean flavors, remains genuinely extraordinary and largely intact. The cooking at Galatoire's, at Dookie Chase's in Tremé, at Clancy's and Upper Line and dozens of other restaurants scattered through the city has no equivalent in American food culture. It is a distinct regional tradition with a depth and specificity that exceeds what most cities can claim. The musical culture, while diminished and displaced by the economics of post-Katrina New Orleans, has not disappeared. The second-line tradition, the brass band parades that wind through New Orleans neighborhoods on Sundays and at funerals, is still active. The Jazz and Heritage Festival, which began in 1970 and grew into one of the major American music festivals, still draws enormous crowds to the fairgrounds in late April and early May. Frenchmen Street still has music on most nights that connects to what the city has actually produced, rather than what tourists have been told to expect. What's left worth saving is most of New Orleans that isn't Bourbon Street. The street itself, at this point, is less a part of the city's living culture than a container for a party that happens to be located in one of the most historically and culturally rich cities in the country. The question the city faces, and has been facing for decades without resolution, is whether the revenue generated by that party can continue to justify what the party costs. Bourbon Street is not going anywhere. The economic forces that created it are too entrenched, the city's dependency on its revenue too deep, for it to be transformed by anything short of a catastrophe. And even Katrina, which came as close to a catastrophe as anything short of the city's permanent disappearance, mostly just reopened the street faster than it rebuilt the neighborhoods. But New Orleans is more than Bourbon Street, and always has been. The city that produced jazz, Creole cuisine, Mardi Gras in its full cultural complexity, and an urban character unlike anywhere else in America is still there, still operating, still worth the visit. If you're willing to walk a few blocks in a direction the brochures don't point. The Tennessee Williams, who wrote A Streetcar Named Desire in the French Quarter in the late 1940s. The Louis Armstrong, who grew up in the back-of-town neighborhood just outside the quarter. The generations of Black Creole families who built the musical and culinary traditions that made the city famous. None of them were on Bourbon Street. They were in the city that Bourbon Street has spent decades consuming and replacing. The rise is well documented. The fall has been gradual and it isn't finished. Whether there's anything after it depends on decisions the city of New Orleans hasn't made yet. If this gave you a different way of looking at one of America's most famous streets, hit like and subscribe. More coming on the places where history and the present are still negotiating. See you in the next one.